Hello. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this seminar entitled Challenges and Opportunities for the UN in 2017 and Beyond. My name is Kari Osland. I am the head of the research group on peace and conflict here at NUPI. Before we start, I will just give a few practical informational words, which is first of all that for those of you who need to go to the toilet, there are toilets out in the hall to the left. Secondly, this seminar will be streamed directly on YouTube. And third, there are some publications lying outside, and you're free to take those with you as long as there are any left when you leave. Okay, so let us start. As of 1st of January, António Guterres, former Prime Minister of Portugal and UN High Commissioner for Refugees, has taken up the position as new Secretary General of the UN. This happens at a time where the world is facing enormous challenges, such as the wars in Syria, Iraq, South Sudan, and Yemen. In addition comes a number of humanitarian crises, as well as global challenges such as climate change and violent extremism. Mr. Guterres will have to deal with all of this in a time when Donald Trump is about to enter the White House. And he has signaled a tough attitude towards the UN, in addition to having no clear foreign policy program. To discuss some of these challenges, I have the great pleasure of introducing Mr. Sam Dawes, the director of the project on UN governance at Oxford University. Mr. Dawes has a long CV. Among other things, he has spent 30 years working for the UN. He used to work in the office of Kofi Annan, and he has authored around 13 books on the UN. So, Mr. Dawes, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kari. I'm delighted to be here in Oslo. Norway as a country and NUPI as a leading international think tank has long been both an intellectual powerhouse and a moral force behind the United Nations, assiduously arguing for strengthening for the UN's conflict prevention, conflict resolution, and peace-building functions, while advocating for a more democratic yet still effective United Nations. Kari outlined some of the formidable challenges that face António Guterres, who's been in office now for just 17 days. And before I turn to some of those challenges, I think it's important to be reminded of really how much the United Nations has achieved despite the many challenges and the need for reform. The High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid bin Raad, reminded us recently on the UN's 70th anniversary. So I just wanted to read a segment from that. He said, multiple conflicts have been resolved or prevented in the last 70 years, thanks to UN mediation, adjudication, or intervention. National independence has been assisted and promoted. There's been unparalleled, although incomplete, progress on recognition of the rights of groups of people who for centuries have been marginalized, including women, people of African descent, and LGBTI people. Unprecedented advances in health, in wealth, in education, and in the ability to make decisive personal choices have immensely improved the lives of enormous numbers of people, particularly the most vulnerable. There's been investment in the development of the Global South on a scale and of a complexity that would previously have been inconceivable, with far greater emphasis on practical work to ensure equality, health, and opportunities for women. So those are the positives, but none of us, I think, could fail to be appalled by the growing humanitarian crises facing civilians worldwide. 60 million people globally are today displaced from their homes because of conflict and violence, the highest number since World War II. The plight of civilians in Afghanistan, Syria, Nigeria, South Sudan, Iraq, Yemen, to name but a few examples, who continue to be killed daily with impunity, remains a stain on humanity. Now, Guterres comes with enormous experience in this area. He ran the UN's Refugee Agency for a decade. Some countries have taken more of the burden. Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey have each accepted not just thousands, but millions of refugees. 1/3 of the population of Jordan are now Syrian or Palestinian refugees. Similarly, Kenya and Cameroon have received huge influxes of refugees from neighbouring countries. So what more can the international community do? Well, one, share the burden for these host countries, lifting rules on aid to middle-income countries. Find ways to make refugee intake a positive for both them and the host communities. And it's not just about changing the law to allow refugees to work, although that's important. Countries like Malaysia have led the way there. Turkey's done it, but we found with Turkey that you still only had 200,000, initially 2,000 refugees with work permits, despite there being over 2 million in the country. So you need to change practice as well. Refugee camps are not a long-term solution. Remarkably, the average time spent in a refugee camp is 17 years. So more integration is needed between longer-term development and refugee assistance. And more funds are needed. Former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon estimated up to $20 billion a year. And ultimately, we'll only address the problem of humanitarian crises if we tackle the source of forced migration, conflict, natural disasters, and climate change. So moving on to the challenges for international development, the UN's played a major role in mobilising attention and resources to reduce poverty, first with the 8 Millennium Development Goals, and then more recently replacing them with the Universal Sustainable Development Goals. These 17 goals to be achieved by 2030, built on some of the important areas identified by the MDGs, health, education, and gender equality, but built on those new goals for energy, for infrastructure, as well as for peace and accountable institutions. So very importantly, the means as well as the ends of development. And it had behind it a leave no one behind philosophy, a sort of human rights thread running through the new goals. A crucial enabler for the UN will be the use of smartphone technology, social media, and crowdsourcing, part of a statistical data revolution. The challenges ahead that Guterres and member states must navigate in this area include that each country must set and feel ownership of credible targets and indicators. Funding of the new goal framework must be integrated with the climate change funding streams arising from the Paris Agreement. The UN must break down its own siloed institutional responses in order to respond to the convergence of development, humanitarian assistance, and conflict management. Poverty and conflict are converging. The poor are increasingly concentrated in fragile states. At 50% today, this concentration is projected to reach 80% by 2025. Future conflicts over access to food and water are likely to increase. And traditional aid, government assistance, is becoming less important than remittances, which are already 3 times greater than aid and growing, less important than foreign direct investment, less important in some cases than the taxation raised by developing country governments. Development will increasingly be more about policy choices and harnessing the new and potentially remarkable new breakthroughs in science, technology, engineering, and medicine that are going to happen over the next couple of decades. There's a huge potential to harness human ingenuity of the next generation of young professionals. The UN will therefore likely need to strike a new balance between its normative, operational, and resource mobilisation roles. And key is how we mobilise trillions of dollars of pro-poor, low-carbon infrastructure investment by sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, and insurance companies. And there's a role for the Secretary-General in breaking down mistrust of these sources, and a role of the Bretton Woods institutions in de-risking investments, especially currency risk. On climate change, Ban Ki-moon said that we were the first generation to have the capacity to end endemic poverty, but also the last generation that has a chance to stop catastrophic climate change. And the UN has contributed already in 2 important ways. One, it's provided a forum through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for the world's scientists to present a coordinated and authoritative evidence base. This has convinced almost all governments that climate change is influenced by human activity, that it's a real threat, and that unchecked, the situation will get worse. Secondly, it's provided, through the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, a process by which states can agree a set of voluntary national commitments that will then be ratcheted up over time as technological breakthroughs and political will allow. So the challenge for the UN and for Guterres is, number one, preventing an unravelling of the Paris Agreement in the light of potentially weakening US support under President Donald Trump, who's said in the past that he felt that climate change is a hoax perpetuated by the Chinese to make the US more dominant economically. Secondly, to help mobilise and unlock these new financial flows, particularly from the private sector. And third, maintain the overall political commitment of countries north and south. On peace and security, Guterres inherits a UN that has evolved sophisticated and successful conflict management tools, but its response to regionalised conflict, terrorist movements, organised crime and cyber threats has not kept pace with the transnational and evolving nature of these challenges. Integrating UN development and peace mechanisms to sustain peace will require shifts in culture and new incentives for collaboration. The UN must overcome its traditional blind spot to the political economies of conflict. Guterres can encourage a greater Security Council focus on conflict, so I'm losing my pace, on the political objectives of peace operations, and increase investment in mediation and other conflict prevention tools, along with taking forward the recommendations of the global study on the implementation of UN Security Council 1325 on women, peace and security. The area of women's involvement in peace and security has been increasingly recognised. UN Women recently launched a landmark independent study on looking at 15 years on from Security Council Resolution 1325. The study found that having more women peacekeepers and police was critical in gaining trust in communities. That the more female police you had, the higher the reporting rate of sexual assault. More women are needed in leadership roles in UN missions, but it's getting better. Insufficient, but it's getting better. In the last 4 years, between 15% and 25% of UN field missions were led by women. And in the summer of 2014, 40% of ambassadors on the UN Security Council were women, a record. It's gone down from there, but it needs to go up again. And importantly, involving women in peace negotiations is effective. Statistically, negotiations influenced by women are more likely to end in agreement and more likely to endure. The independent UN panel on peace operations, nicknamed the HIPPO report, high-level independent panel, identified 4 shifts that the UN needs to undertake in order to remain relevant in peace and security. First of all, recognising the primacy of politics. Lasting peace is achieved through political solutions and not through military and technical engagement alone. Political solutions must guide all UN operations. Secondly, the need for responsive operations. UN missions must be tailored to context. So we should talk about peace operations, not just peacekeeping, however important that is, to denote the full spectrum of responses. And stronger partnerships are essential, in particular the need to build the capacity of the African Union and other regional organisations and potentially to fund AU operations through the UN regular budget on a case-by-case basis. And increase national and regional standby capability. And lastly, the UN needs to be more field-focused and people-centred. So headquarters needs to be more enabling of field missions, and there needs to be greater protection of civilians, both in the mandate and the focus of operations. Guterres has already recognised this need for a greater focus on prevention. In his first week in office, he notified member states of the internal secretariat reforms he was going to undertake. This included co-locating and improved collaboration over the regional divisions of the Departments of Political Affairs and Peacekeeping. It included better information flows about emerging crisis through the strengthening of the UN Operations and Crisis Centre. He appointed an Assistant Secretary General for Strategic Coordination in his office, reporting to the Chef de Cabinet, to provide analysis and advice across the political, peacekeeping, development, humanitarian, human rights and rule of law pillars, and has appointed a senior advisor on policy to initiate and lead horizontal and vertical integration for system-wide coherence on conflict prevention, politics, tools and operations. But perennial challenges remain. Peacekeepers often sent into countries still at war where there's no real peace to keep. In the words of Guterres, greater conceptual clarity and shared understanding of the scope of peacekeeping must pave the way for urgent reforms that create a continuum from conflict prevention and resolution to peacekeeping, peace building and development. It's more easier said than done. How do you integrate peace and development? I remember when I worked for a while on the 38th floor as a note taker for Kofi Annan, it was really apparent when he went out of the elevator onto his floor, you turned left and there was a Secretary General's office and the Chef de Cabinet and all the people who were working on a kind of 24-hour media cycle and battling crises. And you turned right and you went to the Deputy Secretary General, management reform, longer-term implementation, the initiation of the Millennium Development Goals and the longer-term things. And there was a real sense of a difference in scale and timetable. And those two parts of the office very rarely actually to talk to each other in a strategic way. So I think that's going to be a huge challenge, and already Guterres has shown, I think, a great strides in the initiatives he's taken. I think a real challenge will not be around the issues the UN faces, formidable as they are, but is actually how Guterres navigates the shifting sands of political power in the world. Both political and economic power in the world is moving southward and eastward. There's a lot of uncertainty about the US approach to multilateralism, with Trump saying that he has doubts about the multilateral norms and approaches to climate change and non-proliferation. We've seen also discontent among African countries, not least with 3 African countries expressing their wish to withdraw from the International Criminal Court. So a feeling of lack of African agency within the United Nations. But also there's interesting shifts in other directions. The UN's been known for really a polarised north-south split around many issues, particularly around the politics of New York, with countries of the north prioritising peace and security and human rights issues, countries of the south official development assistance from the north. But it feels that we're going through a process of rapid change in that area. China in particular has engaged significantly in UN peacekeeping, both building the new and support for the African Union apparatus. It helped build the new headquarters for the AU in Addis Ababa. It's contributed additional 3,000 peacekeepers and police. It's putting $100 million in military assistance to AU capacity and $1 billion to a new Africa Peace and Development Fund. And traditionally, you had this split in the non-aligned movement of generally being reluctant to agree to Security Council robust peacekeeping or Chapter 7 resolutions. But on a case-by-case basis, we've seen real departures. We've seen the GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council, led by Saudi Arabia, pushing for a Chapter 7 resolution on Yemen, when the West was pushing for Chapter 6. Because of generally everybody disliked Gaddafi, you had the Arab League supporting Chapter 7 resolutions in Libya, the AU increasingly in African countries individually, because of Boko Haram, because of what's been happening in Mali and DRC and South Sudan, Somalia and elsewhere, really supporting very, very strong, robust action by the international community. India at the moment stands at the other side of the non-aligned movement in standing much more in terms of traditional non-intervention, yet it also has been an extremely important leader in the contributor of UN peacekeeping troops, along with its neighbours Pakistan, Bangladesh and Nepal. And the BRICS have been much more proactive, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, in working together on a broader peace and security agenda than ever before. So how should Guterres respond to that? And I think I've got about 4 or 5 minutes left, so I'll be very quick on this. First of all, on appointments. He's already appointed his Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed from Nigeria, who's had fantastic experience both as Nigeria's Environment Minister, but previously as the advisor to Ban Ki-moon's on the creation of the Sustainable Development Goals, and appointed a Brazilian seasoned diplomat to be his chef de cabinet, and I think she will also engage Brazil and Latin America more with the kind of strategy around the Secretary General's office and his role. With the election of Trump, are we entering a period of great power bargaining, and what does that mean for Guterres and for smaller powers? And what's the dilemma about the need to involve emerging powers that are more important in the world in the United Nations, yet UN structures are very hard to change. The UN Security Council in particular, it's very hard to envisage how you can get agreement by member states on how it can be expanded. Yet without reform, it increasingly looks like an archaic relic of 1945. The world is much more flatter than 1945, so it's much harder to divide states into 2 categories, permanent and non-permanent. That's one reason it's hard to change. Secondly, the bar in the UN Charter to any reform is very difficult. It requires 2/3 of member states to both sign any amendment to the Charter to expand the Council, and then 2/3 of member states' parliaments to ratify it, including at that stage the 5 permanent members. And regional rivals, they don't see the benefit of countries like India, Brazil, South Africa, Japan, Germany becoming permanent members at their expense. So whether or not we can find a way of coming up with an intermediate category short of permanent membership that would be acceptable, and maybe a focus more on how the Security Council works, a focus on a code of conduct on the veto and so on. So what Guterres can do is find ways of giving greater agency to the 3 African members of the Security Council, make greater use of friends and contact groups, which can involve member states that are not immediately on the Security Council in matters of peace and security that affect them. Have greater integration with regional organisations, but also with the G20 and the BRICS mechanisms. So to end, I just want to say something about vision, communication and firmness. Former Secretary General Boutros Ghali often joked that Secretary General stood for scapegoat, and Guterres, an important part of his role is the ability to set, communicate and gain support for a realistic expectation of what the UN system can and what it cannot do. With his wealth of humanitarian experience, he's likely to focus on creating a culture of conflict prevention. He must, with tact, humility and tenacity, alternately inspire, encourage, scold and embarrass states into living up to their international commitments. He's assumed the role of Secretary General at a time of great flux in world affairs, and he needs our wholehearted support. The United Nations is a unique, precious and potentially fragile experiment in humankind's recent history, and its continued survival, and I hope flourishing, relies in no small part on all of our continued public advocacy for a strong, credible and effective international institutions and for a fairer, sustainable and more peaceful world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sam, for this thought-provocative introduction. I now have the pleasure of inviting the following panel of discussants to respond to Sam's presentation. I would ask you to please come up and join me here. We will first have Liv Torres, Executive Director at the Nobel Peace Center, former Secretary General at the Norwegian People's Aid, and with an academic career also from places such as FAFO and the University of Oslo. Second will be Hans Jakob Frydenlund, currently the Director of UN Policy at the Norwegian MFA. He has worked at the Norwegian mission to the UN and to the EU, and he has more than 13 years of experience from conflict resolution in Africa. And lastly, my colleague Cedric de Koning. He's a senior research fellow at NUPI and a senior advisor on peacekeeping and peacebuilding for Accord. Cedric has served on the UN Secretary General's advisory group on the Peacebuilding Fund and worked for the Department of Peacekeeping Operations in Timor-Leste and New York. And he has written numerous articles and books on the UN. So, without further ado, the word is yours, Liv.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Yes. Fantastic. Thank you very much, and thank you first and foremost to Sam Dose for very interesting initial input. Now, I've been a bit uncertain as to whether I should start with telling you this story, but point number one, I'm so tempted to do it. Point number two, it all happened in public, and it's many years ago. So I think it's only fair now to tell you about the occasion when Jens Stoltenberg came as Prime Minister to Norway to tell us about the new UN reforms. And there was this big public meeting in Oslo, 2008, 9 maybe, or earlier. It must have been earlier, actually. And he tells us about all the plans, everything that was entailed in the reforms. And then he opened up for questions and comments. And me, with the background as head of international department in the Norwegian People's Aid, I had sort of a small little concern. Having seen the UN operations in field, I asked Jens Stoltenberg whether it was fair to assume that they would still support the humanitarian initiatives of the national big organizations on the ground while they were waiting for the reforms to sort of settle in. And he waited with his answer to me until the very end. He turns to me and he said as follows, more or less quoted directly. He said, anyone who is, I think he was at that stage he was so, embraced with all the ideas and looking forward to the reforms being, folding out, etc. So he looks at me and he says, well, all I want to say, he said, is that anyone who is critical about the UN is an enemy to the UN. That was like, and I was fairly young at that stage, so I thought, it took me a few years to get on my feet again. Let me put it like that. And I'm starting with that story because I think it's fair to say that in 2017, with the world around us, the new Secretary General, etc., we need to be critical. We need to be critical, we need to be open about the mistakes happening on the ground, the weaknesses, etc. And I think we need to actually sit down and make a new approach. Discuss and create a new consensus on what do we want the UN to produce? What are the top priorities? And I'm saying that also because the list is like endless of everything that the UN has to do, needs to do. The list is endless. We know the world we have around us is deeply worrying. We know that the challenges are immense and the list is long. And I think we also need to keep in mind that the changes happening around us are deep. They're caused by shifting powers southeast, as you highlighted, but also by the economic situation changing a lot in many countries. Inequality is increasing internally in many countries, creating huge political challenges, especially in those countries where the institutions are weak, the respect for human rights, international conventions, etc., and democracy is relatively weak, etc. So we have massive challenges, basically. Let me start there without giving more detail to all of them right now. Guterres said in his first speech to the Security Council a few days back that we need a new approach. I think the signals that he is giving are very promising. I think, and let me say that from the start off, that I think with his background, his personal qualifications, we should have high confidence in actually his ability also to deal with it. Now, let me say three things that I think need to be included in this new approach. I think, well, four things. One, the UN needs to discuss again and preferably find a solution to how to deal with internal issues. Most of the conflicts we have now are internal. They are also deeply linked to political issues, inequality, etc., and I'll return to that. But while we on the one have still, at least in theory, a principle of responsibility to protect civilians, on the other hand, there are also strong member states that do not want to have any interference in internal issues. So it needs to be approached very carefully and principled, and with the strong new voices of the South, the East, and maybe some new voices in the North and the West as well, in order to find new solutions as to how to deal with this. Point number two, we need to put, and I know it's included in the Agenda 2030, but we need to put inequality and lack of, respect for human rights higher on the agenda. Because when Guterres says that we need to look at prevention, these are the two issues that are, in my view, some of the most important ones. Inequality increasing in the South in parallel with high growth, but also in the North. In many countries, creating political spillover effects that makes it also important that we approach this in a principled way, looking at both the carrots and the benefits that goes with reduced inequality. Finding new tools and measures also to actually make it attractive to countries to reduce inequality. And I know this sounds very easy. I heard someone saying yesterday that there's now with increasing inequality, there was a new Oxfam report published yesterday, and someone obviously looks at this as almost an automatic, a technical process. There's nothing we can do about it. Of course, there's something we can do about it. Inequality is increasing because of policy, because of political facts or acts rather, or the lack of them. We need to do something about it because it creates conflicts, it creates political spillovers, etc. The third that I want to highlight is we need to look at the organization of the UN. We need to look, you talked about the silos, the silo mentality. There are too many organizations. We need to look at efficiency. We need to look at how we can put the same demands forward and expectations to the UN organizations as we do to any humanitarian and development organization from a member state operating in field. Higher efficiency, higher delivery, more focus on the field and on protection of civilians. And that's also going to increase the legitimacy of the UN and the trust in the UN towards other organizations and the countries where they are operating. And then lastly, the world has changed. And of course, we get into the very difficult issues of Is it possible to reform the Security Council? Is it possible for some member states to hand over more power to the others, etc.? But we need to create a new political agenda. We need to create a list of priorities, an agreement on what are actually the top 3 priorities. Because right now the chance is very high that we are just making the list longer and longer of all the things that has to be done, while the delivery and the actual output of the UN is going to get smaller and smaller. It's the political challenges we are confronted with that are the most difficult right now. And that means a totally new agreement on a top priority list with strong representation, I mean, of the countries from the south and the east around the table to make that priority list. I'm going to end there.
Thank you very much, Liv. Hans Jakob, please.
You hear me now? Yes. Thank you, Sam, for an excellent introduction to today's theme. And thank you, Liv, for following up. One thing you didn't mention too much about, it was new American administration. And I would say I will not blame you, because it's a difficult exercise just now to know exactly where they're going. And if you look, and it's easy to make all types of negative and catastrophic visions, but if you look back on former shifts in American administrations, they create challenges and they make opportunities. We know from last time that when you had the Republican administration in Washington, they immediately went to punish the work on sexual rights and sexual health by physically stopping financing the UNFPA. While on the other side, the other fund program, the UNDP was able to communicate with them to further its agenda to strengthen the elements where they were strong. In general, the relationship between Washington and New York at that time was rocky, to put it mildly, but still things were able to move forward. We also know that providing about a quarter of the basic funding of the UN, what America will do has influence on how the organization is working. And sometimes this forces our discussions on how to make things better and more efficient, and that's so this can go in various directions, but it will not be. But it will be a quite interesting ride forward. Then coming to Guterres, and I have to say, maybe if I can see, maybe it's been the most popular election of a Secretary General that we witnessed. And everything has been doing since will just give our full approval. He says the right things. He's doing the right things. We see that he is serious when he's talking about gender equality, and he is serious when it comes actually to focus on prevention. He's serious when it comes to put human rights first. His problem in many ways is that he's now so popular, so he can then expectations are high and he can disappoint. But at least we know there's a strong leader of the UN now, and that is good. But as you pointed out in your introduction, it's a number of other developments that are going on, which are important. And the UN, and you should always remember that UN is it's a membership organization. So it's not, as a membership organization, it cannot get better than that the members allow them to. And you alluded to some of the problems Very often we see the North and South divide, but there are other divides also, which are always important, between the P5 and the elected 10 in Security Council. You also mentioned the regional powers, which may for regional and the regional rivals was the word I think you used, which makes it difficult to move forward. And the charter is not perfect, and particularly when it comes to changes, it's really cumbersome. And if you're not able to get consensus, it's difficult to move forward. And that's also why it's important to move beyond our normal groups. When I started in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we first talked just about the Nordic group. We still talk about Nordic group. We love our Nordic neighbors. Then we had the like-minded, but then there were always also other European, the Dutch and the Canadians and so on. But it will be, I think it will be impossible to really do something constructive now in the UN without having cross-regional groups and work with people from all regional groups. And that's also what we tried from a Norwegian side before we had before the election of the Secretary General, by gathering a cross-sectional group of countries in what we call the UN 70 initiative: Colombia, Ethiopia, Ghana, Indonesia, Jordan, Mexico, Norway, and New Zealand, to agree on a number of recommendations for the new Secretary General. I brought with me the paper. It's out there in 2 versions. This is a short one, and this is the long one. And if you read it, you say what's actually what is really ground shaking here, because this is all common sense. But yes, the thing is not that we're able to find a new radical approach. The thing is that we're able to agree on it and able to move forward on it. And that is what is necessary. And this will be one of the big challenges we'll have forward, how to be able to reach out to all different regional groups and be able to have people moving together in the right direction, and thereby also be able to unlock a number of the impasses we see in the UN system. As you mentioned from the Secretariat, I always love the 5th committee, because there the first secretaries overturned what the prime ministers were agreed on just days before by sheer power of inertia. But we need to reach out wider and to be able to work also on these things to be able to face the challenges that are approaching. And with Guterres as Secretary General, I think we have the best point of departure within the organization. And with Trump as president, I think we'll have the most interesting environment to push that forward. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans Jakob. Cedric, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to Sam and Liv and Hans Jakob for their contributions and inputs to the topic. I think I want to start by agreeing with Liv that we need to acknowledge the shortcomings, what Guterres likes to call the underperformance of the United Nations. And I think, first of all, we can start in the context of the UN being responsible for maintaining international peace and security. You know, for the long list of conflicts we have raging at levels that we all of us can't understand how it is possible for the world to sit by while we have the conflicts raging in Syria, in Yemen, in Libya, in South Sudan, etc. And the degree to which the UN's hands are tied in terms of making contributions in many of these areas. And at the same time, the huge challenges that we face in terms of dealing with the refugees and migrants and that are being generated by these conflicts. It's not, however, as if we're in a situation where we have not already deeply analyzed what our challenges are. We went through a period, especially in 2015 and 2016, where the United Nations have undertaken a number of thought processes, of reflecting on how it is performed over the last couple of years. And we've generated a number of recommendations for how to go forward. So there was the high-level panel on peace operations that Sam mentioned. We had also the review of the UN peacebuilding architecture. We had the review of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, the 1325 resolution. And at the same time, we reviewed the Millennium Development Goals and agreed on a whole set of Sustainable Development Goals and on a set of goals for climate change. So the goals have been set out and the recommendations have been made, and it's now very much about how to implement these suggestions for how we can improve the United Nations. And this is, I guess, where our focus comes in then on looking at both the context within which that can now occur over the next couple of years, and we agree that we are facing a very turbulent world where we have huge changes taking place in the global order, and that to a large degree limits the room for the United Nations to do certain things, especially perhaps to undertake large-scale reform of structures like the Security Council. Things like those kind of reforms are probably less likely in a world that is changing very rapidly, and where people are rather looking to the United Nations for certainty and predictability. But I'll try and also take Liv's challenge of 3 priorities. And I would say our 3 priorities would definitely be, first of all, in the area of peace and security, a focus on prevention and a focus on sustaining peace. And I think this is also something that the new Secretary General, António Guterres, has echoed. He calls prevention the priority for the United Nations. And I think when he speaks about sustaining peace, it seems to me that he really understands that when we talk about sustaining peace, we talk about how we need to invest in building resilience through the Sustainable Development Goals, through peace building and other means, through development in society, so that they have the resilience to deal with conflicts before they become acute, before we employ the normal tools of mediation or sending special envoys to do mediation and to do peacemaking and to do peacekeeping. So it's really about using the full system tools of the United Nations to prevent conflicts very early on in the process. And that links also, I think, very well to the second 2 goals, or priorities, which I would identify, which would be climate change and fighting poverty through the Sustainable Development Goals. And these 3 are very closely interlinked, because the more peace and security we have, the greater our ability to achieve our Sustainable Development Goals, and vice versa, of course. So these 3 areas are very closely interlinked. And then perhaps the last area I'll just touch on is the area of how to make the United Nations more effective in implementing these various steps. And here Sam has already mentioned a couple of things which the new Secretary General has announced. It's very early in his administration, but he has already taken a number of steps in terms of the cabinet-style executive committee that he's announced for managing the different parts of the UN system, as well as the various steps around improving coordination and synergy that Sam has mentioned earlier. And I think these various areas speak very well and give us good hope for potential improvements in the effectiveness of the United Nations. And the last thing I would mention is, as Hans Jakob has also emphasized, that implementing these various recommendations that we've identified, achieving our goals when it comes to the Sustainable Development Goals and climate change, is not something that relies only on the Secretariat, but perhaps first of all on the Member States, and how the Member States undertake and support these goals nationally, and how they support the United Nations. And in this area, I think the aspect of how do we finance and fund the 3 priorities I mentioned is extremely important. At the moment, we have a funding system which favors, through the assessed contribution system, responses to conflict. And it favors large-scale peacekeeping operations. That is where the large part of the UN budget enables it. And so it's very important, I think, then, especially for member states, to seriously think about how we can change the architecture around funding the United Nations so that we can direct more funding to prevention, to sustaining peace, to areas of climate change and sustainable development goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm going to open up for discussion and questions, but you had a small comment, Liv, before we start?
I have a small comment because I think we all talk a little bit about Guterres, and we've also all talked a little bit about the fact that UN is a membership-based organization. It needs political agreement, and I just want to underline that it's actually, you know, if we look back, Guterres is one of, well, at least compared to his recent predecessor, he is an ex-politician. And I think even that in itself is a huge advantage now when he's going to try and make a new agreement around the table on the top priorities. He comes with political experience, he comes with experience in negotiations, he comes also with a good track record of not always sort of, you know, showing off, but having, you know, under the table discussions. He achieved a lot through more sort of, well, behind closed doors discussions in the UNHCR, and yeah, the political background is highly important here.
Yeah, thank you for that important reminder. When I now open up for comments and questions, I will ask you to please state your name and institutional affiliation if you have one. I already have one on my list, but please don't be shy. I know it's very warm in here, but we have still half an hour. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Hilde Salvesen from the Norwegian Center for Human Rights. And listening to you, I was wondering, Sam, if you could elaborate a bit more in this, what did you call it, the shifting sand of political power. Human rights seem to be not the particular strong case. How can the UN bring or make human rights up front the reality now? And to Hans Jakob Frydenlund, very interesting initiative with the UN plus 70. What will be the main priorities from Norway in the time to come to use this alliance? Thank you.
Thank you. If you're okay, I'll take a couple of questions before you get to answer. The second on our list is a former Norwegian ambassador to the UN.
Thank you very much. My name is Johan Løvold. I think we all agree, and certainly the panel did, that the new ESG's emphasis on prevention is very exciting. At the same time, and I think Liv Torres alluded to that, it also touches upon some of the most difficult issues, like internal matters, etc. So my question is maybe primarily to the keynote speaker, because you alluded to some of the methods and the new SG might have in terms of getting around some of these issues, but I would challenge you to maybe elaborate a little further. In other words, what kind of wiggle room does it really have in order to make the Council, Security Council, work more effectively and maybe overcome today's paralysis on so many important matters? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll take one more now. Kathleen Jennings, FAFO.
Thank you. Thanks for very interesting presentations. I wanted to pick up on something that Liv said, because you're talking about the need for accountability and for standards, and that we undefined, I don't know if you meant Norway or the international community, but that we should have kind of the same accountability and standards for the UN as we do for other organizations. And I want to challenge our Norwegian Foreign Ministry representative here, because One way of actually imposing accountability and standards is through participation. Norway is very good at putting its money where its mouth is because Norway has a lot of money. Norway isn't so good at putting its boots where the problems are, so to speak. So how would you see Norway's role in helping to ensure more accountability and standards, especially if there is a very strong seeming lack of political will to actually put Norwegian human resources into these conflicts? And I finally also just want to say, everyone's very focused on Trump. I'm American. I'm also obviously very focused on Trump. Don't forget the Republicans in Congress, which is not the same as the Trump administration, because they are much more disciplined and evil than just undisciplined and evil.
Thank you. Well, we have three quite challenging questions, so I think we'll let you answer some of them. Anyone who volunteer to start? Sam, do you want to start?
Yep, thank you. So, Hilde, your question about the shifting sands of politics and where does human rights fit into that? There was a real danger that I think that approach from the US might prioritize peace and security and stability over human rights concerns in addressing civil war situations, for example. So I think that's regarded against. What Guterres can do, I think, one is emphasize the leave no one behind aspect of the Sustainable Development Goals, that none of the Sustainable Development Goals will be met unless everybody has access to them. And that means whether you're disabled, whether you're in a remote geographical part of a country, whether you're from a religious or an ethnic minority. So emphasizing through data, being able to disaggregate down to the individual, and ultimately with smartphones and that kind of capability where you'll be able to have, I think, a revolution in accountability between them, in a compact between governments and civilians, and in a way that the international community through technology will be able to monitor that. So I think that is one area. And the second, I think in peacekeeping, he needs to, with this new initiative he set up to review sexual abuse by peacekeepers, which has been a huge stain on the UN's reputation, he needs to be very clear and very firm about the UN will not accept peacekeepers undertaking abuse. So the sort of human rights commissioned by the UN itself. The other example was the effect of peacekeepers bringing cholera to Haiti in the wake of the earthquake. And Ban Ki-moon, very late but very, I think it was very good that he acknowledged UN responsibility for that. Is it Johan? Jan, your point about what can Guterres do in the context of the Security Council. Well, Article 99 of the UN Charter gives the Secretary General the responsibility to bring to the attention of the Security Council issues which might be a threat to international peace and security. And that, in a sense, is the bedrock for permitting the Secretary General to use his or her political offices and to spread that widely. And I think that article has been underused in some respects. So I think there's more that Guterres is already doing, which is building up the monitoring and conflict prevention capacity of the Secretariat to be able to challenge member states when they're not taking early action. Secondly, I think we might take a leaf out of the book of the first UN Secretary General, Trygve Lie, who happened to be a Norwegian. Some of the best diplomats have always been come from this part of the world. He took a very political approach to his immediate cabinet. His senior appointments were not only meant to head the particular UN departments, but they were meant to liaise with key member states. And if you think of the initial appointments, nearly all of them women, which I think is also commendable. But Guterres has picked key countries like Nigeria, like a Brazilian woman for his chef de cabinet. And I think the ability to use those individuals that he builds in his team to liaise with key countries that are outside of the Security Council at any given time, I think will be really crucial to build on the legitimacy of the Council while we're waiting for it to be reformed in the longer term. And then, I suppose the last comment about the United States is, I think the United States is indispensable for the United Nations, but also the UN is vital for US interests, and it's really to make that message clear. I think there are allies in the Republican Party as well. The older George Bush brought the US back to the UN. He repaid the dues which were owed by the United States, and brought around a coalition to reverse the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. And I think actually working with moderate Republicans will be really crucial for the future of the United Nations.
Thank you very much. Any of you want to answer?
Okay.
Yeah, Hans Jakob.
There were two questions here. First, Elizabeth asking us what would use, how would use or use the NDF, the UN 70 group for. First, I don't like the word using it, because it's a sort of coalition, and we have then which meant for giving advices to the Secretary General that we agreed on, and also then in a bid for support him on achieving these goals, and these are wide-ranging, like putting conflict prevention at the heart of the UN peace agenda, like the SDG agenda, like climate issue and human rights. So it's more how we are able, and this is one of the few of these type of groups. So it's how we are going to move forward together. How we are able to actually use it to further our common agenda in this respect. And that was that depends on how what we play in and what they do. We have to do that's what I can promise. We'll be active of keeping this alive. We'll be able to be active in pushing these agendas. Exactly how I will have to come back and discuss in 6 months' time, a year's time. The other one about boots on the ground. Well, if you say put shoes on the ground, I will say we are very well represented. So I object to that question. We Norway has been very active, both with resources and with people. We have a number of leading humanitarian organizations in Norway, which are putting the staff from people on the ground. We have in our work on supporting different humanitarian and peace operations had the challenge: should we just send Norwegians, or actually should we open up, because we need to have people from all over the globe, particularly from the south, and there comes that we have been more and more reluctant of pushing Norwegians in this respect. What is correct is not very many Norwegians in military personnel, peacekeeping operation. That's correct. But if you look over history, that has always fluctuated, and we are there, and we will not leave it. So that's my response.
Steve?
Am I now on? Or yes, fantastic. I may have misunderstood your question, or you did. But I'm tempted to comment on the answer and the question. I'm of those who actually think that it would be good to have more Norwegians represented in key UN organizations, both in the field and in headquarters. So, I mean, promoting that, I think, is a good thing. But what I alluded to initially was the fact that from the donor side, all the national, big-scale international organizations are expected to have high standards and deliver and respond on issues like anti-corruption, on ethics, I mean, there's no limit as to what they are reporting on. The UN organizations don't have to do that. I think organizations tend to be more efficient, more cost efficient, more respectful, etc., when they have a certain level of demands from the outside world. I think, well, up to a certain point, but I think that's a good thing. So I think it should apply also to the UN organizations. Anti-corruption regime, ethical guidelines, yeah. So the question as to why it is not demanded from the UN organizations, while it is demanded from the big-scale international organizations, I think is a good question.
Thank you. Cedric, do you want to come in here?
I was not going to take the floor, but no, I have to respond to Liv, because I think it's a bit of an unfair statement. Maybe you can argue for, in particular cases, for more standards or more ethics, but there are certainly various standards in place. There's countries like Norway and all the other countries that contribute funds and otherwise have a very close eye on the United Nations when it comes to these things, and all the different agencies and funds and programs or peacekeeping operations have to report on these issues. So there may be improvements, but to say that there's no standards or that the United Nations has to comply with, I think that's an overstatement.
I didn't say that there was no standards, but I said that I think the same standards should apply. And that means also that, for example, on corruption issues, when the Norwegian organizations report, organizations that actually are active in the field, when they report on corruption cases they have regularly, why shouldn't the UN organizations do the same and be transparent and show how they deal with these issues? They don't.
Okay, I think we will then move to, is it short, Hans Jakob, or?
No, I can pick
Okay.
up later.
So we have a few others who want to ask or comment. First, Jon Karlsrud from NUPI.
Thank you for excellent presentation and comments. I would ask, I guess, Sam Dawes and Hans Jakob a question regarding legitimacy and the UN Security Council. With Brexit, the UK is no longer kind of representing Europe together with France, but again alone on the council, flying solo in a way. So to legitimize that position will be increasingly important for the UK. Norway is vying for Security Council membership quite soon. So I'm just wondering if I could hear your thoughts on how this may enhance scope for collaboration between the UK and Norway going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bjørn Skogmo. You have also been in the UN, haven't you?
Thank you for both the initiative and for some excellent presentations. The UN certainly needs criticism. There is a lot of things with the UN in both its policy-making process, in the negotiating process, and its implementation to criticize. But I think also it is necessary to look for the hidden agendas behind those who criticize the UN, and there are a lot of hidden agendas. For instance, many of those, I'm thinking, for instance, in Washington, who criticize the US for its ineffectiveness, come from quarters that do not really want the UN to become effective. And I could prolong this list. I have two sort of pet ideas in looking at the UN. First is to support what has been said, that the UN is basically a membership organization. It is established, it is governed, it is funded by member states. It is basically, in the structure that was set up, an intergovernmental organization that has tried over the years, and a lot of very positive things have happened in strengthening partnership, particularly with civil society organizations, much more slowly and much later, also with private sector, to mobilize the resources and innovation that is now sort of firmly anchored in a world economy that is driven by the private sector. The second pet idea is the systems perspective. And I think that was inspired by the years I spent in Geneva with the UN system in Geneva. because when I was there in the 1990s, I was struck by the fact that there was very little contact between the separate UN specialized agencies and the UN system. They were basically driven by very strong constituencies in member states that did not really want to have anything to do with the politicized negotiating and environment in New York. I think that has changed, and it was necessary to change it because this addresses the issue of the silos that were addressed by you. I think, firstly, I think the reforms initiated on Kofi Annan's side with the reform establishment of the Chief Executive's Board and the subcommittee, high-level subcommittees has helped. I think the fact that we now have a broad intergovernmental agreement on, for instance, a sustainable development goal has helped to set up some common goals for the whole system to strive against. But I'm not updated on the thoughts of Guterres on this system perspective, because I think in one way, I think it did not move that much forward during the period of Ban Ki-moon. I may be wrong. There were a number of cross-sectoral issues that helps, because I think the interagency cooperation is now more driven by the issues. There are some issues regarding terrorism, climate change, poverty that require a much more closer interagency cooperation than we used to have. But I would like to have your assessment on this agenda now will be moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have one more question here.
Good afternoon. My name is Anne Katta Silva. I'm from the UN Association of Norway. My first question is to you, Sam. I would like you to elaborate a bit more on the accountability and protection of people in need, the beneficiaries, which is also relating to what Liv mentioned in terms of increasement of inequality. When you shared how UN and Guterres is now making, the list of how they're going to prioritize, how will they respond in terms of the protection and accountability? Because this was a big issue during the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul. Then I have another question to Cedric. It would be interesting to get your views on how do you see other actors or institutions, like for one example, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, if they're sort of competing or pushing the UN and the role they want to play. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I give the panel the chance to answer, I'll just tell you that while they answer, you can think about a last question, because we do have time for one more round of questions and comments. So anyone who wants to start? Cedric, do you want to start maybe on this one?
Well, let me start on the last one. As you may know, as I'm sure you know, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa together, we have been doing some research on the rising powers in the context of peace operations and peace building, and also in the context of the BRICS. And when it comes to, I think this question, there has been unhappiness on behalf of some of these countries in the BRICS grouping about the way the World Bank and the IMF has been managed, the number of votes or the weight of the votes that those countries have, which in the past have been based on contributions to the bank and so forth. And it's in that context of several years of requesting, demanding greater change and change not happening, that the BRICS then first announced the new development bank and constituted it, and also the Asia Infrastructure Bank. I think both of these are examples of the BRICS saying, if you do not want to work with us in reforming international institutions like the United Nations, then we will create alternative institutions. I don't think it is a move away from the United Nations, But I think it's effective pressure on especially the international financial institutions to reform more, to reflect more the real changes in global order and global power that is taking place. But I do think that as we're going through this very turbulent period, that people will look more and more to the United Nations as the center of stability and predictability. And so I see larger a strengthening, especially many of these countries in the BRICS grouping especially. I rather see them as looking towards and wanting to strengthen the United Nations rather as wanting to move away from it. It's more some of the traditional powers like the US and so on that seems to have less faith in the United Nations going forward and are more interested in creating alternative institutions like the G20 and so forth.
Thank you. Hans Jakob?
First to leave the issue of our demands on organizations, you used the word corruption, is that I will say there basically is no difference, at least from our side. But is that we expect the same from all recipients of Norwegian assistance, they be international organizations or they be NGOs. There are, however, different ways of how these mechanisms are working out. And the way you made questions sounded like they were like UN organization where protected against accountability, that they were protected against investigations into misuse of funds or worse. But I think that's important. It's important that we actually don't fall into that rhetorical trap, because being a membership organization, then being run by the rules it's run, it's not as straightforward to actually react to a UN organization than to an NGO. But still, the mechanism there still it's reactive. If things have to be censored. One difference is also scale and also visibility. UN is big and it's visible, so you will have, and they should also attract attention. Then it comes to a question about legitimacy from Jon. I'm not exactly clear where he wanted it. It's once at the composition of the Security Council is, we all agreed, it's not optimal. It's what we have, and it would be better if it's different. So therefore, we have been engaging actively in the different discussions of how to do it, to enlarge it, to give a bigger voice to the nations that were not present around the table back in 1945, to do it in both categories. But it's the working methods of the council between the P5 and the E10 is there because there are some. It's a circle to square how we are actually able to have a sort of how you are able to make binding decisions without getting the people who don't want to abide them just to leave. And that balance, we're not able, we haven't found any formula to move away from it still, and I haven't seen none of the proposals of reform which actually solve that problem. So this is a headache we're having to work on, and in the meantime we've been trying all types of been attempting all types of activities to make it to increase legitimacy or acting or ways of interacting with them in different ways. There's been increased transparency around the Security Council, which is important. There is it's more and more common that actually non-members are able to interact with the work of the Council, which is important. we also see that the incoming countries do have impose a sort of self-discipline, particularly in the countries that would maybe not be in there today if it made the same type of arrangement. So there are a number of challenges, but also it's just to throw around the corruption word. I think also to emphasize too much on legitimacy is dangerous, because if we undermine the legitimacy of the Security Council, we have nothing. There are weaknesses there, but it's what we have.
Thank you very much. I think, do you want to answer this, or shall we open up for a new round? And you will in any case get a final comment. Do you want to answer any of these questions coming up now?
There were a couple for,
yes, please. Okay.
I'll try and go through them quickly. Just a follow-up on international appointments. I think it's brilliant if we have more Norwegians and more people from the south encouraged by Norway to apply for these posts. And it's, I think, one great function of bilateral Norwegian foreign ministry posts can be helping identify and cultivate young professionals in those countries and encourage them to apply for UN careers. And like Liv said at the beginning, we do need, this is an opportunity also for countries of the north and the west, I think you put it, to have more of involvement. And I think the importance for the legitimacy of the Security Council of smaller and medium-sized countries, elected members and others, playing more of a role is epitomised in this type of UN 70 initiative, which is a fantastic one that I know that both the Ministry and NUPI have been involved in creating. It's the way of breaking down the different regional groups is having these types of initiatives. So I really wanted to applaud that. So the quick questions to me, one from John of Brexit, a horrible word, and I wasn't a leaver myself, but we have to make the best of it, and that's how the UK will view it. And I think there'll be a real opportunity with France taking the mantle of representing the EU on the Security Council. The UK will need to have a raison d'etre to legitimise its continued occupation of a permanent seat. And I think working with Norway and other Nordic countries who have really pioneered these sort of approaches, I think will be crucial. But Norway being in a similar relationship to the EU, I think that there's a lot of partnership that can happen. On your question on the Chief Executive's Board and what Guterres can do, he's already announced he's going to set up a new executive committee and a deputies committee. It won't replace the CEB, but he's asked them to review what their function is. But it does strip away a lot of the machinery, which became quite cumbersome under Ban Ki-moon with the different policy committees. So he wants it more streamlined, more strategic, and joining up the development and the peace and security apparatus more. So we'll have to see how it works. He said he'll have it in place by the end of March. So it's something to watch. And I'll come back maybe on the accountability issue later. One thing that we haven't talked about, the terrible effect of the rise of Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, Daesh on humanitarian workers. There have been direct attacks on humanitarian workers and an increase generally on attacks on civilians. And I think that's something that's a huge challenge for the United Nations in how it works and the assumptions of the rationality of the actors it deals with and the assumption that they will play by international rules and laws. We have to change our mindset.
Thank you very much. We have actually one question from the audience, so I'll let you ask that one. And please be quick or short, and also then I will give the panel a chance to answer and also give a final comment.
Hi, I'm Stein Erik Hoyen. I'm from NORAD. We are talking about UN as a political and as an operational body in a way at the same time. When we are arguing for our contribution in Norway to the UN, it's very much on the principle side. It's on the political side. It's our role in when the UN has the convening, in a way, function. Most of our funding is not going to that part of the UN system. It's going to the operations, and it's not the peacekeeping operation. It is to the different organizations: UNDP, UNICEF, World Food Programme, UNHCR, and etc. And when we're talking about reform, are we talking about everything has to be reformed at the same time? Is that possible? Is it possible to also to think more to Hans Jakob? Is it possible to think that we can actually play a role in a reform of the UN organizational side, where we actually have a great role to play because of our big funding to this side of UN, while we are in a way waiting for or looking at more of the political dynamics where we have a lesser role to play when it comes to reform the Security Council and all the other political parts of the UN. The problem with the UN on the country level is not that they have, it is actually that they are not able to convene, they are competing. The UN organizations are competing with each other and with the NPA and other organizations. So they become more like any organization and no longer as a UN body, even when they have the role as coordination. And you have organizations that are coordinating the other organizations that are coordinating each other. So it's becoming very much, and everyone needs funding. And then they need funding to meet and to organize themselves. The one UN operation was very much money, extra money to do even more competitions.
Thank you very much. So then we will have a final round of comments. So I'll ask you to be brief, please. Sam, do you want to start?
Yep, I will. Thank you. Well, it's a really great point, and I'll be brief. It's got two aspects. One is UN agencies competing or not. Under Kofi Annan, they had the Delivering as One initiative that was meant to work under a UNDP resident coordinator, a resident representative, and people subsumed their brand. At a time of austerity, donors want to show the attribution of their money, their taxpayers' money, exactly where it has been spent. And that's caused a kind of an arms race among UN agencies, hiring strategic communications consultants to feed back to donors the latest management speak. Yeah, that's the worst sort of style of it. So the solution, I think, is to bring in incentives for cooperation and remove some of the unintended consequences of the sort of the multilateral aid review approach that the UK and others have taken, which have good aspects, but others. But in terms of where Norway and other countries can really make a difference with their money, Norway is already one of the few countries that pay more than 0.7% to development aid. But I think strategic use of voluntary funding of bits of the UN, like the Policy Planning Unit in the Secretary General's Office, the Mediation Support Unit in Department of Political Affairs, and the Lessons Learnt Unit in DPKO, and funding the kind of work that NUPI does with the African Union, developing their capacity to look at conflict prevention and post-conflict peace building. Those are things that are so hard to fund, but if you get them right, they transform the way that the UN does business. And Norway is one of the few countries that has both the political will and the money to do that kind of nimble, really strategic funding.
Get a little bit confused as to now I think I'm on. Yeah. Now, I'd like to follow up straight from there, because I think even, I mean, if we can go on, how to spend Norwegian money. What I would rather have done, instead of, putting money into sort of, this and that and this and that, I would have asked Guterres, your priority, and this is a little bit to your question as well as to what his agenda is, and his system thinking, Bjørn. He is focused on coordination. He's focused on, in all his speeches, including the first one to the Security Council, and he is talking about coordination, a new approach, more delivery in the field. And I would have asked him, build your agenda, get in the main players, and come up with the 3 or the 5 sort of top agenda points to do in order to reform this and actually bring more delivery in the field, more coordination and more efficiency, and we will fund that. That's what I would have done, but you can comment on this later. I just have to sort of give a few words to this standards of the UN. Does it have no standards or enough standards? Of course it's got standards, and of course these, you know, I also haven't said that the UN is not delivering in the field at all. Mind you, I mean, some of the UN organizations are exceptionally good, but some are so bad you can't imagine. And it is very difficult to see how. You also smiled at that, actually. It's very hard to see how, right now, how members, donors actually support, strengthen, or punish accordingly. So, you know, I mean, I think we all agree that, well, at least Guterres does, that we need to have more delivery on the ground and more coordination. So, yeah. And then can I also add to that the following, that you talked about protection of humanitarian workers. I mean, that in itself reinforces or underlines the need to focus more on what is actually happening on the field. Slightly different actors on the ground, different UN actors. But one has to come up with a thorough response or action list after what happened in South Sudan, for example. You know, UN needs to tell the world how it's going to respond the next time when there are humanitarian workers sitting in a hotel, sending SMS and calling the UN up the road to please come and help us. We are under attack. And there's no response. So, yeah. Just one final little point to Cedric's view on the competing institutions and BRICS. I hope you are right, but I am worried that you are not. I'm worried that these initiatives that we are now seeing, following from Anne Katz's question, the new institutions being set up are actually competing. I see worrying signs from both India, South Africa, Brazil, China, Russia, that they are actually not looking to the UN. They are looking to set up other platforms, institutions, etc., which in turn reinforces my initial point that Guterres' main challenges are political, and therefore also my hopes that he's the right man for the job.
Thank you very much. Hans Jakob?
Thank you. Yes, I can start with actually agreeing. I think he's the right man for the job. And it's coming to Svein Erik's question. I don't like the word reform when it comes to UN. UN, in many ways, is a dysfunctional organization. But very often, every time when I get a new Minister of Foreign Affairs, said, now we're going to reform the UN. No, the UN is an organization that has to develop all the time. There is no, and it's no quick fixes, because it's dysfunctional, because there are so many layers of different problems that are around. So you have to fix them one by one. And thanks to Björn for pointing out the hidden agendas. We all have hidden agendas, some are more hidden agendas than the others. Therefore, it's not very often not clear cut where to go. So and that we see, we agree on something, and we think move forward. Even if we move forward, and then we discover no, that was not a good option. So, but we always need to have Secretary General with a clear vision of where it's going, and what we see from Guterres for the time being, he has that vision, so he can lead forward. And then we are in a situation that, yes, we have been doing a lot together with partners to help that process. Sometimes you find the solutions inside the UN, sometimes you find it outside. Sometimes you find it in other international organizations, like when it comes to African Union. It's the scale of the problems in Africa is such that you cannot solve it just from outside, but you need the regional organization. But it's weak, so there's a building process going there. But if you look how that developed over the last 10 years, I say it's been successful. If you see how it's now, it may be more critical, but it's moving forward. So we will have to continue trying to play out the different way of making to move forward, and give the support that he will be able to evolve these organizations in the way that makes it that it remain as important as it is now, or get even more important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lastly, Cedric.
Thank you. I think seeing that we're all deciding here how to spend Norway's contributions to the United Nations, I'll also focus on my last two comments on the funding issue, because as we know, that is usually a major incentive for how institutions work. And the first comment is that I think it's probably only about a dozen countries that are funding about 90% of the voluntary funding to agencies and funds, and also to peace making initiatives, mediation efforts, and so forth. And I think Sam has in his example, given a very good example of how some of the ways in which we insist on voluntary funding on the one hand, on the other hand, introduce certain results-based management regimes and so forth, how that have unintended consequences. And I think it's this dozen or so donors could really make a major contribution, instead of just blaming the United Nations, looking deeply into themselves and coordinate better amongst themselves. What kind of messages are we sending? Because these donors are the ones who are also in the executive boards of these agencies, funds, and programs. So I think these donors should take much more responsibility for the way these agencies and funds operate, because they have a major influence, both in terms of funding and management and oversight over these agencies and funds. My last point is about America and all our fears about the American administration and its role towards the United Nations. The one thing I would say about that is that I think we are enormously guilty for making the United Nations so vulnerable. Hans Jakob, I think, mentioned a quarter of the UN, which certainly would be the case for peace operations. But I think I've seen some figures that America pays up to 40% of the United Nations if you include all the agencies, funds, and programs and so forth. And an institution like the United Nations can't be a responsible international organization if one member state pays up to 40% of the dues of the institution. So I think it's very important that the rest of the member states take up a greater responsibility and make sure that no one, not America today, not China tomorrow, or anybody else, has that kind of influence on our joint international organization, the United Nations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We are slightly over time, but I think this has been a great debate. We've learned a lot. We have heard quite a lot about the challenges. We've heard a lot about, well, we've heard a lot of recommendations, and what was mentioned here is that we don't really need more recommendations. We need to start implementing the recommendations. But I would also say that I think one of the things that we have heard across the board is that we need also to break down the divide, whether we talk about the different parts of the UN family or whether we talk about the member states, the North-South divide. And I think there that not only there is work need to be done at headquarters, but also, of course, member states. But I also think that civil society, research institutes like NUPI, NGOs, we have a role to play there to help work down or break the divide between, in particular, the North and South. So please join me in a big hand of applause to Sam, Hans Jakob, Cedric, and Liv.